going on, everybody? I'm Jason, and this is Tennessee Mountain Homestead. Today, we're going to go ahead and try to put an alternator into the old mud mower. I've been riding this thing around for a couple months now, and I've noticed that the stock Predator alternator or charging system doesn't charge the battery until it gets up into a higher RPM range. And that's not really going to work for what I need it to do, because I've got an electric fuel pump, I've got these off-road lights, I've got the stock lights and tail lights that work, and I have a winch. I've been looking around for quite a while. I even bought a full-size GM alternator thinking that I'd have space up in front of the motor right here to mount it. And it's close, but it's too big and it's not going to work. This is the alternator I purchased when I was working down in Florida, just kind of on a whim. And it's a GM off the shelf at Advanced Auto Parts. It was pretty cheap. And I thought it would fit, and it might fit, but I was having a couple of issues. The first major issue I've had trying to find any alternator that'll work for a counterclockwise rotation is that the fans on most alternators that I've found are clockwise cooling. So I even went to the extent I found a bi-directional fan for this alternator on eBay, and it would have worked with the old Corvairs from the 60s. I even considered getting one of those little John Deere or whoever makes them on eBay, those little alternators I've seen some guys running on their rigs. And those are like 55, 60 bucks from what I've seen. And I would need to get the regulator for it, I believe. And that's another like 40 or 50 bucks that I've seen. So I decided to go another route. I was also looking into a corporation called Tough Stuff Alternators. They're here in the USA. I think they're in Chicago or something like that. I could be wrong. Anyway, Tough Stuff Alternators on their website claims that all their alternators are bi-directional. But the only problem with those is for the ones that I could use, like a small one like this, it would be $200 or $300. So I kept searching and searching, and I finally found one made by Proform. And this thing is tiny. It's only, from the front of the pulley to the back of the alternator, it's 5 inches. And it only weighs 4 pounds. So I believe I paid $129 for this alternator. Free shipping. Anyway, that was comparable to getting all the components I needed for that little 20 amp alternator. And this thing is a 50 amp alternator. And also, it comes with these instructions. It says, just mount this unit so that the pulley rotates and run a 10 gauge wire from the battery to the back of the alternator. That's it. It's also a bi-directional cooling fan inside of it, so it doesn't matter if it spins counterclockwise or clockwise. Plus, this thing came with a little paperwork with it, and they tested it before it left the factory to show that it works, it charges. And it makes 10 amps at 1800 RPMs and 55 amps at 6,000 RPMs. So like I said, that's my reasoning for putting an alternator on this rig, because we like to ride around a lot at night, and I'm just putting around for the most part on this thing. I hardly ever get into the higher RPM ranges. I like to fast idle it on the carburetor adjustment screw and put it in first or second gear and just basically crawl all over this property through the creek and everything else. I barely push the gas pedal. So then the entire time I'm driving on this thing at night, or even the daytime, the fuel pump's running, and at night the lights are running. So I need to put an alternator. And without any further commentary, let's get into it. All right, it took a few minutes, but we got the body panels and the hood off, as you can see. And my plan is to put this alternator right up in here, but the oil cooler is in the way. And I'm also going to use another 7-inch pulley. I'm going to put it on the crankshaft in front of the other pulley, and then this thing is going to live, with this cooler moved, it's going to live right up here in the front of the tractor behind the grill. Alright, we got the oil cooler unbolted, and before we go taking off the hoses, I'm just going to try to pry this thing out of the way a little bit. And see, that's where the alternator is going to sit, right like that in here, with the oil cooler relocated up here somewhere behind the grill. So we'll just have to build a little bit of bracketry to hold the alternator and some sort of adjustment to tension the belt. I went to town yesterday and I picked up some of this 1/2 inch SAE fuel line. And I picked up 4 feet of it because the line that's on this transmission, on this oil cooler, looks to be like it's 1/2 inch, but I don't know. Hopefully it's not some sort of a metric size, because then we'll be hosed. No pun intended. Alright guys, quick update. So we went to town and got some 3/8 and then 7/16 fuel line because the 1/2 inch stuff was way too big. We got back, realized the 7/16 stuff was a little bit too big. The 3/8 stuff was, we could jam it over top of these nipples on the oil cooler, but it still was not the same as the stuff that was on here stock from Predator. So what it turns out there was a part number on the little hose that was on here stock, and it was hydraulic hose. So luckily the local Napa Auto Parts had some 3/8. It's not the hydraulic hose they had there. They also had stuff with a steel braid inside, which would have been way too stiff to try to force over these nipples. But they had this stuff is 400 PSI. It looks a lot like what came off here, and so we ended up going with this. So that was like about a 3-hour ordeal, going to town twice. But we're back, and we're going to get continued on this thing. The first thing we're going to do is relocate this oil cooler, because where it was on the motor before was going to prevent us from putting the alternator there. And I think I'm going to put it right up in this corner behind the grill. So we need to fabricate a couple of little brackets to come off of here, hold it in place, we'll get that mounted, and then start on the alternator. Alright guys, little update. We got the oil cooler mounted. If you can see here, I just drilled and tapped into this stock hood support, whatever this piece is called. Drilled and tapped into there with a 1/4-20, and then I took a little piece of 1/8 inch bar stock, bent a little offset in it to come back over here and meet this one, welded it to the frame here, it's drilled and tapped there. Next we're going to get the oil lines connected back to the motor. We're going to go ahead and paint where we welded that little piece on there with some John Deere green. It'll look just like a factory part. And then it's time to get to the alternator. So we found the perfect spot for the alternator to go, which is right about here. But there was a hole in the frame right here for where the old engine mount used to be. So we had to weld a piece of steel in here to cover up that hole. The next thing we're going to do is make an L bracket so that this alternator can sit right on top of that piece of steel, and it'll be the pivot for it. We got the alternator mocked up. I made a little bracket for it out of a known 90-degree piece of steel. Made a little bracket for it, bolted it to the alternator, put it in place. Then with our 4th finger, we put this piece of bar stock over here. Stefan held that. I held the alternator. We held our mouths just right, and then we tack welded it into place. It's perfectly straight with the engine crank pulley, and it has a pivot. So we got to run to the store because it's going to get late and we want to have the belt. We measured the belt with a piece of another V-belt that we had. It was junk, so we cut it, wrapped it around the pulleys, measured it. It needs to be 33 inches. So we'll catch up with you shortly. All right, we just got back from Tractor Supply, and we figured we needed a 33¼ inch belt is what we measured out on this thing. And I got a 34 just in case, and I'm glad I did because it took the 34-inch belt. Check it out right here. It fits pretty tight, it fits pretty perfect. Once we get the bracket to adjust the tension on this thing, we'll weld it up solid and we'll test it out. All right guys, quick update. So we're trying to figure out how we're going to tension this alternator. And what I came up with is I had this alternator mounting kit. We were trying to use this and like figure out how we were going to mount it and weld it and all that. And then it just seems like it's too much. So we came up with a better idea. We're going to go ahead and use these 2 bosses on this cylinder head. Now these used to be the mounting bosses for the big muffler. There's 2 here and there's 2 over here. They are 2 different size bolts. One's like an M8 or whatever that is, and the other one's a 10 millimeter. Well, at least the head is probably an M6, or I don't know metric that well. But what we did was, I also had a Heim joint in stock, a tie rod that has a turnbuckle. You screw this, and it either expands or pulls together. So we're going to go ahead and use this And then it's not long enough to reach up there, but we're gonna go ahead, and what I did was I used a Sharpie and some cardboard aided design, and we Sharpied on these bosses on the front. I took this piece of cardboard here, how I wanted it, and pushed it into the bosses, and now we got these nice little marks where we're gonna have to put the bolts through. So what's going on here is I found this a couple months ago at Harbor Freight. It looked interesting. It's a hollow punch set. So you can go ahead and punch through stuff like cardboard, I guess bolt holes for gaskets. Haven't tried them yet, but we're gonna go ahead and do it. So give us a second and we'll be right back. All right, as I mentioned in the last clip, we're gonna go ahead and try to use these Harbor Freight punches just to make the holes in this piece of cardboard as accurate as possible, because we're gonna use the bolts to bolt this thing on. So let's do this together. Let's see what happens here. Worked pretty good. Now that's the larger bolt, and this should be the smaller bolt. Nice. Better than using a drill bit. All right, we got our cardboard in place. We got it bolted in place with the bolts we're going to use. And I got the heim joint, or the tie rod, in place where I want it. And then I took a Sharpie and I outlined kind of a rough shape of how this thing's going to look, and I notched it on the bottom here for that bolt right there. Now we're going to go ahead and cut this stuff out of this, what looks to be 1/8 inch bar stock, and if anything we might weld a gusset on the back of it or something so it keeps it from bending left and right. We got the alternator bracket all bolted up, all mocked up. Everything's looking lovely. So check this out. This was our plate that we fabricated, our bracket to come off of the head. We come out here with a little bolt with some little bit of space for this heim joint, for this tie rod, and we can go ahead and push down on the alternator and tension the belt. That should be plenty of tension to turn that alternator. Now what we're going to do next is I need to take this back apart, take the alternator off, and finish welding out the bracket on the base of I'll come off the frame. So we need to do that. Once that's welded out, we're going to paint these parts, put everything back on, and we're going to fire it up and see how it works. All right, it's been a while later. It's about 10 o'clock at night, but we got this thing all done. Check it out. So the oil cooler's been relocated. The alternator's installed. I used parallel number 10s back to the battery, which are landed right here. And we've got this thing all ready. I disconnected the stock alternator wires coming out of from behind the flywheel. There was a clip connection, a plug connection that went into the voltage regulator. I just unplugged that so they don't clash. So the next thing we're going to do is get this thing out the door. We're going to fire it up and see if it charges. Alright guys, I'm sorry about the noise, but it's running. As soon as we fired this thing up, it started charging. Check it out. Here's my leads. Check out the belt. Guys, I'm going to take that as a win. I honestly thought this was going to be a pretty impossible thing because of how tight everything is in here, and it really wasn't that bad. This thing has an alternator just like I wanted. It charges right off at idle, and so it's the next day. We were up late last night working on this thing. As you saw in the footage, as soon as we fired this thing up, it started charging. But one more thing I want to do before I close up the hood and the side panels on this thing is test the RPMs of the engine at idle and what the alternator is spinning at. And I put a couple of reflective strips on both pulleys so that when we fire this thing up, we'll know how fast it's spinning using this instrument. All right, I just got it warmed up. I'm gonna go ahead and restart it, and then Stefan's gonna follow me down and he's gonna show you on the display how fast the engine's spinning compared to how fast the alternator is gonna be spinning. And right now it's at kind of a slow idle. Normally when I'm putting around here and I don't want it to stall out going up things like, you know, inclines and through the creek and stuff, I bump it up to a fast idle using the screw for the slide to make it fast idle. So I'm going to start with a slow idle and then bump it up to a fast idle, and then I'm going to rev it up to like 3,600 RPMs, what it's rated at, and see how fast the alternator is spinning at that point. Over 14 volts at a slow idle. So that's charging even though this thing's barely running. Now I'm going to bump it up to a faster idle. That's right about where I would be putting around the yard in second gear. So there you have it. That alternator spins 8,500 RPMs when this thing's running at 3,600. So I thought that might be a cool data point for some of you guys. All right, guys, that's going to be a wrap for today's video. The alternator's done. I'm loving it. Now I can run my lights at night. I can putt around all night long with the lights and everything else running. I might even put a car stereo in this thing. I don't know, maybe a horn, a Dixie horn, a car alarm, a USB port. Sky's the limit. And maybe some cooling fans under the hood. But all that jokes aside, once again, please comment, like, and subscribe. My name's Jason with Tennessee Mountain Homestead. We'll see you on the next one.